Hi there, my name is Dusty Rhodes and you're welcome to Amplified, the Engineer's Journal podcast.
Again, it comes back to engineering principles. I think, engineering is a really good base for time planning. And if you can understand the technical challenges and relate that to time, you get a lot of respect.
Today we're meeting a professional who has spent his career at the absolute sharp end of construction, overseeing the planning and execution of some of Europe's largest and most complex capital projects. From a $600 million Formula One theme park in Dubai to the enormous European Spallation Source research facility in Sweden, he has led project teams where the stakes can be astronomical. He's here today to share the critical difference that strategic planning makes in these projects and how he now brings that world-class experience to clients through his own firm, Strata, giving them the definitive edge in construction. It's a pleasure to welcome Enda Grimes. How are you?
Hi, Dusty. I'm good. Thanks for that big welcome.
Always a big welcome, Enda. Can I start off, Enda, by asking what got you into this wonderful little niche of the world we call engineering?
I always had an interest in, building and construction and building things. I used to love Lego as well as a kid, and something that hopefully I'm passing on to my own kids. And I suppose an understanding of how things went together. And, during my teenage years in school, I would have worked, with local builders and on building sites. And I suppose just that knowledge and that kind of passion for engineering and building came to fruition. From there, I went to UCD to study civil and structural engineering. That's where the initial passion came from.
One of your first big projects, I believe, was working on the criminal courts complex in Dublin, which is on the edge of the Phoenix Park and cost 150 million. Huge money. Tell me about that building, because we see that building on the news all the time. What makes that building special?
That project, I worked on it with my time with PJ Hegarty's, who I started my graduate career with. And really, I suppose they were my first exposure into planning and the way that they approached it through my old mentor, Joe Mahoney. But back to that project, what makes it special? I think the scale, number one at the time, the shape of the building, it's curved. So all the walls, all the concrete structures are curved. Inside, as an engineer, for me, the things I remember are the massive big roof trusses on the building and those being lifted into position. It was a design and build project. Just the features, the facade. I think it's a timeless building, and that's probably something that we don't see so much these days. If you look at old buildings, historical buildings, they always look in place and they always feel in place. I think that's one of the iconic buildings that we actually have in Dublin, that every time you look at it, it doesn't look old or it doesn't look tired. It just looks like it belongs in that space. But from an engineering perspective, it was a big undertaking. I think the circular shape was a challenge and it was very different. And then inside, from an architectural perspective, really high-end finishes, and one of the challenges as well, because it's a court and you have criminals as well coming up and you have jury people, the challenge was to keep everyone separated and to figure that out. So look, very, very interesting project. Look, I was only, a young planner at the time supporting the team, but I learned a huge amount from being thrown in and observing.
Often when you're on a big project like that and you're young, you learn a big lesson. And usually by making a mistake and going, oh dear, I'm in trouble. Did you have one of those?
There was one mistake actually I made in my time, not necessarily on that project. So as a planner, or the way that we do planning, you need to, we see tower cranes around Dublin, and when you're building a project, coverage of a tower crane is very, very important, because if you can't get the materials to the building, it can have a big impact. And I think on one particular project, I mixed up the scale on the drawing when I was preparing a tender, and I put a tower crane that was too small, specified a tower crane that was too small on the project. And, when the guys, I think they were successful with the tender and they went to look at the tower crane, they were there, this is what we specified is too short. So look, just little nuggets like that, which are things that kind of stick with you. You don't try and make that same mistake twice.
Describe to me another project that you worked on that we wouldn't be as familiar with the criminal court building, but you were in Dubai working on the Formula One theme park. Now, how did you go from Dublin to Dubai in the first place? And then tell me about the project.
Yeah, look, I had 4 really good years with PJ Hegarty's, and I guess I was still reasonably young, and I probably always wanted to do a little bit of travel and just experience the bigger world. At the time, it was before the big global economic crash, but not too long before it, and I'll come back to that. So I got the opportunity, there was lots of opportunities to work internationally, and one of those happened to be for a project in Dubai. And funnily enough, I interviewed with a company out there, a project management company, and the project I was actually meant to go on was Tiger Woods golf course out there. And I was there, okay, that's quite interesting. Tiger Woods, quite a good golfer, and it would be interesting to see something different. But when I arrived, it changed, and I was working on a Formula One theme park. So I was there, okay, well, that's not too bad either. And essentially what it was, a big theme park with lots of different rides or amusements or whatever you want to call it, and structures. And actually, when you boil it down, the approach is quite similar. When you're on any theme park and you see all the buildings, they're really structures behind and embellished then by the theme park rides. And probably the interesting part was seeing how that all comes together in the background, the design and all the people involved in actually designing these mega amusements or attractions, and that was happening from all over the world. So the biggest learnings I had were working internationally with a wider team of people. We had people from America, we had people from Australia, the Middle East itself, and Irish and UK people as well. And it was probably working in a bigger environment than I had been used to, but still the same principles and the same approach applied. But then you're out in the desert as well, so it's very different. It's just a completely different experience.
But now here, when you're working on a project, if it's a hot day in summer, you might touch on 24 degrees. Dubai, completely different story. It's at least twice that. You said it's different building in Dubai. Heat is one thing. Give me an example of heat. Give me an example of other things that are different.
One fundamental difference as well is it's a more labor-driven market, and I suppose they depend a lot on direct physical labor to complete the work, and they would have a big supply chain from, in particular, India and those countries in that region. So that's very different for a start. So whereas in Ireland or the UK or Europe, to be fair, you would have a more mechanized approach, probably a more structured approach. In the Middle East, it was a case of increasing labor numbers to get things done. I suppose one big difference when you think from an engineer's perspective, sand and beside the sea and that salty environment can have an impact on structures as well. So the way that you build foundations and you treat foundations in the ground is quite different. There's quite a big, extensive build-up, and not a waterproofing approach, but an approach to stop contaminants getting in towards the reinforcement that can undermine that. Everything is built in concrete as well because of the sand approach, or predominantly. So and that's due to the labor-driven market. And then at different periods of the year, they don't work on site during the day because it gets too hot. And then you have factors like, it was a Muslim country, you have Ramadan, where the majority of the supply or the labor force might be fasting during certain periods of the year, which is not ideal. And then because of the heat as well and pouring concrete, a lot of that work is done at night, and you would have 24-hour shifts really, and that's how they can build things a little bit faster as well.
Did all of these things cause you problems, or did you just have to adjust your way of thinking?
I think, look, as I said at the outset, I think on these big projects, and no matter how big the project, it's still made up of a number of smaller projects. And that's always been my approach. So if you look at a Formula One theme park, and within that there was a mega 5-star hotel, which was one part of it. And then I can't remember now, but there was about 15 or 16 major attractions. But with each of those attractions or rides, it's really just 15 buildings. So it's about, I've always been able to compartmentalize things and break bigger things into smaller pieces. And I think when you can have that approach and mindset, that's a good starting point. I think, look, the foundation as an engineer of what you learn, and I think we're quite strong at that foundation in Ireland, and particularly from the contracting environment where you have lots of different exposure, I think that still applies. But of course, you have to learn, there's different methods and ways of doing things in different countries. So you have to adapt to that. But I think if you stick to your base principles and your core principles, I think you can pick things up quickly. And I think engineering is one of those disciplines and one of those, I suppose, foundation stones that kind of crosses borders. And I think that's what makes it a really good profession.
You've mentioned foundations. This might be a silly question because I'm not a civil engineer myself, okay? I'm a sound engineer. That's what I tell people. In Dubai, the big difference to Ireland is that you're building on sand. And sand doesn't strike me as a particular solid surface to be building on.
No.
What was your experience of that, and how do you get around that problem?
for basement construction, you would have a lot of temporary retaining works to allow you to excavate. And, whilst I didn't work on any major high rise over there, I did observe a lot of them, and you have mega foundations, mega big pile foundations going down to the bedrock. So it's quite interesting to see that and to understand that. So I think it makes it more challenging actually in many ways, because it's hard to clear areas. It's hard to clear a site, whereas here in Ireland, you have clay or boulder clay or whatever. In that sense, it can be a lot easier to work with.
You would have been there kind of mid-noughties, would you? 2005, 2006?
Just right before the crash.
All right. So that was my first trip to Dubai as well. And I remember they were building the Burj Khalifa. Were they doing that when you were there?
They were as well, yeah.
You must have heard an amazing story about putting that building together.
Not so much, in the sense that there was so much things happening in Dubai at the time that, look, wherever you looked, there was just things happening. I think what stood out, and the thing that always I remember from Dubai, and I've been back there since, is when you fly into the airport and it's a cloudy day and you just see all these buildings sticking up out of the sky. And it's quite daunting, to be honest. That's one of those buildings, those iconic buildings, when it's been built, that you're just going, what the hell?
I know.
And it's quite different if anyone that has flown into New York or wherever, you're quite remote, when you're on the airplane. In Dubai, you're nearly just
in town. Yeah, absolutely.
To be honest, there's not anything that really stands out, because there was so much happening. Like everywhere you looked, there was, at the same point, there was the Palm Jumeirah or those structures being built.
And the World, they were building the World at the same time.
Exactly. So it was just building and construction everywhere. And whilst it was a big tower, it was just a big tower going up into the sky. It's the type of place you just lose all context of reality.
To this very day, you lose context of reality. So you move from the heat of Dubai, and next big stop, I suppose, really is Sweden, where you were working on a massive project, the ESS project. Just describe it to me, because I don't know it very well. What it is and how big is it?
What it is the ESS project, the European Spallation Source. So I suppose those that are familiar with CERN or Oak Ridge in the US, it's a big scientific research facility. And what it is it's to test light particles, really fine light particles that you or I could never, ever see to the human eye. And why to do that? It's to test material, I suppose, compositions and new materials that will be future used in industry and as the world evolves. What made it special, it has a 600 meter long linear accelerator tunnel. And then that light or that ion source travels at huge speeds, and it hits a tungsten wheel and generates radioactive material actually as an output of that in this big target station. From there, light particles spin off in different directions, and then I suppose the scientific community using that and different experimental types look at different compositions of materials. So the scientific part, I'm not going to get too much into, because I leave that to the experts.
It's above our pay grade.
But I suppose as an engineer, what was interesting about the facility, I suppose you're building an open cut tunnel, and that was my first exposure of a really long tunnel construction. You have a massive electricity generation that's required to make the building work. So there was a big infrastructure piece. And then the target building itself, was a massive concrete structure because of the byproduct, the radioactive nature of some of the process. It was a really big concrete structure that had to withstand, I suppose, those design criteria. And I think also at the time, it was at the time of Fukushima and some of the disasters that happened in relation to nuclear facilities, and what could happen. So the design criteria was huge. I think, there was changes in terms of what it had to withstand. So that had a big imposition on the design. There was major pile foundations underneath this building. I think piled foundations of up to 1.5 to 2 meters in diameter. So it was really interesting to see that kind of aspect of things. And then probably the total opposite to Dubai, you're working in the colder environment, and how people treat and complete concrete works in that environment as well was the total opposite, where you're heating concrete to pour it or putting pipes through it. You have covered tents to allow you work in, I suppose, more harsher conditions, albeit the south of Sweden, the climate wouldn't be as cold as the north of Sweden. It would be still colder than Ireland.
I'm thinking one word in relation to this project, and that word is precision. Am I right?
Yeah.
Like, it's not down to millimeter correct. You're down to whatever a millimeter of a millimeter is. You know what I mean? Am I correct when I say that? Precision.
Precision, yes, in terms of the structure and the design, but you also have to contend that you're working with scientists at the same time as well, because in a project, and that project started back in, it's 10 years ago now or more, 11 years when I started working on it at the start. The scientific fit out is still ongoing to this day. The thing with scientists is that they're always looking for the next thing. Their design is never frozen, because they're always thinking ahead. And that can be very challenging with a construction project as well, because criteria is always changing.
So were you in a situation then where the design and the construction are both happening at the same time?
Correct. And that was the form of contract. And that's why it was such a special project. And I suppose the contract type and the arrangement of it was set up in such a way to accommodate that through collaboration. So it was a very, very unique project in that instance. And even, whilst there was an overall budget for the project, the final cost was agreed in stages as the project evolved and as the design was released, which was a very different experience to what I know from here in Ireland.
So with your time there, was there any kind of a major design change that had to happen?
Yeah, I think the main one really was in relation to the target building, which was the building where it housed the tungsten wheel, and the byproduct of the radioactive material gets stored there. But the design criteria in relation to, it was classed as a nuclear facility, even though it wasn't a nuclear generating power plant or anything like that. And because of that, it was subject to the same criteria. And because of the disasters or some of the natural disasters that happen around the world, in relation to nuclear, I suppose the design criteria changed. It had to withstand more loads or more impacts. I think it was also, September 11th, unfortunately, and planes flying into buildings as well. And that was another criteria that had to be adopted. What could it withstand the plane flying into it? So that all happened midstream through the project. So, there was a lot of impact and a lot of challenge in trying to finalize the structural design to accommodate that.
So what about you inside yourself? What did you learn and how did you improve working with this madness around you?
I learned that sometimes to be Irish is a good thing in international projects because we're good at talking, maybe, I think. And we're probably have a good way about us with people, and you're able to bring different, I suppose, cultures together. We like to talk, or we like to understand what's happening with people. So I found that that's a very powerful resource, or can be a very powerful resource if respectful and used in the right way. I think the other big learning, communication on projects, and back to my mantra, me as a time management specialist or a planning engineer, once you have a sequence or a phase, or even if it's a mega project, it's about being able to communicate it in small phases and to get buy-in from people in that way. And if you can find a really good way of doing that, it can really influence a project. And that's something that I really learned there as well, or embellished there. And also, again, it comes back to engineering principles. I think, engineering is a really good base for time planning. And if you can understand the technical challenges and relate that to time, you get a lot of respect. And if you're able to talk with knowledge about a challenge and relate it to time, I think it can be quite influential.
I've never heard that before. And let me just repeat it back to you to make sure that I understand it correctly, because you've spoken before about you break down projects into smaller component pieces and you deal with each component piece at a time. And now you've just said what you do is you get buy-in from people for the individual component pieces, and that's how you move the big project along.
Yeah. We had probably about 20 different buildings of different shapes and sizes. And of course, you have to have a knowledge of the bigger picture when you start, and you have to be able to understand, how all the parts come together and set out a high-level phasing overview. We need to do the tunnel first before we do the target station. To make the tunnel operation, we need the electrical input, and you need to have a broad understanding of that. I think engineering, that engineering knowledge helps that. But if you look at any project, it's not made up really of one person running all of that. It's made up of multiple project teams. And if you're able to isolate out each component piece to the individual project teams and let them deal with them on a project by project basis, it's a lot easier than trying to get them to understand or get people to understand every aspect. But they need to understand where their piece fits in the overall puzzle. And I think people like to see that as well. They like to understand the bigger picture and then focus on the detail of their elements and understand how it comes together and how it impacts a project.
Enda, I am dying to ask about your company, Strata, okay? Because it comes across as a very modern, forward-thinking, and there's a lot of emphasis on digital with the company. Is this fair to say? Okay. What is it that you do at Strata that other firms don't?
I would say, yes, very much digitally minded, but also the backbone is an engineering focused approach. So the principle is very much still understanding the job, understanding how it's built, understanding the engineering principles, and then using digital tools to, I suppose, communicate that and to visualize that. And how do we do that? So obviously there's, in time planning or time management or schedule management, there is bespoke software tools out in the market, and, Primavera P6, Asta Power Project, Microsoft Project to a lesser degree, and they're around a long time and still going very strong, and we're across all of those and very proficient in that. Where things have changed even in the last 3 to 5 years, is the use of data and the management of data, and how do you extract the data from these programs. Like a project or a project program could have, some of the bigger ones could have 5,000 to 10,000 activities or line items in it. That's a lot of information to get your head around. So it's how do you take that data and present it in a more condensed way. So working with the likes of Power BI and data management, that's one thing. And then the other aspect as well is, we connect the time plan to a 3D model, and we create animations and movies and productions and digital, I suppose, representations of how the building will be built and how the building will look. So I think it's a combination of taking all those facets together. It's the engineering at the core, and then transferring that approach into tools that you can communicate to people with.
I'm going to show my ignorance, and this is not to be taken out by the editor, all right? But BIM, I know what it is, but do you say BIM or do you say BIM?
BIM.
I should have known that better. But anyway, all right, Grant. So now I get on the question, all right? And we've had BIM for a long time, but you're saying that things have changed a lot in the last 3 years. And I saw a post that you did where you were talking about doing a digital rehearsal.
Yeah.
And I love that expression. And what really surprised me about the post was the amount of people in the engineering community who went, wow, that's a great idea. And it's like, have we not been doing this already? Is this a new thing?
Look, I think it's like everything. It's slowly evolving. So look, what is a digital rehearsal? I suppose it's about building something digitally and rehearsing it and then putting it into practice in real life. And really, where does that come to the fore? Look, you're using the BIM model or the building information model, which I suppose is now BIM is the predominant function now to manage design and projects, and the output is a federated model between all disciplines. And that's the design stage. But really where, a lot of problems still occur is transitioning that design to the execution phase on site. And in today's projects, they're hugely complex. For example, on hyperscale data centers, there's a lot of equipment that needs to be moved into position within a site, whilst there's a lot of logistical items happening around the site, be it utilities, infrastructure. And the whole purpose of a digital rehearsal is to plan out those works in a safe manner, to make sure that it works, to make sure that you have your logistics, where you're trying to, I suppose, forecast what works are ongoing in an area at the same time you're trying to move equipment into an area. And it's really then to get buy-in from the project team. This is the way, or this is the approach. This is how we're planning to do it. And then you're allowing everyone the opportunity to critique that, carry out a risk assessment, to adopt it as needed. And I suppose it's very hard to do that just looking at a sheet of paper. So that's where it can be very powerful.
If you look up Enda on LinkedIn, and I'll put a link in the description of this podcast, he's got a video there of digital rehearsal that they did. And it's fascinating. It's such a simple concept, which maybe years ago wasn't possible. With computing now, you see it and you kind of go, yeah, cool. You're talking about the rehearsal, and the whole point of a rehearsal is to see, well, where do things go wrong, so that you plan so that they don't go wrong in reality. But you can't think of everything. Now we have AI in the game, and AI is able to think of things we might not have considered, but it's also able to run thousands of simulations with different combinations and permutations and all kinds of stuff that we would have never thought of. Is that being incorporated at the moment into digital rehearsals?
I would say not so much into digital rehearsals, but it will come. I think where we're really trying to work with AI within Strata is we have exposure to multiple projects and multiple data from projects and different types. And we're capturing all that data internally, and we're building, I suppose, a database that's AI enabled that is able to run predictions on different projects and different project types based on as-built durations and outputs. So that's how we're, I suppose, using AI the most in terms of, you have a big database, you have a new project coming up, you have constraints, and you're putting into our AI database, look, can you give me all the projects that had this constraint? What was the duration? What was the risk? What occurred? And the power of that search engine and to be able to bring up data that we can control. And I think that's the important part. It's about data that we've benchmarked and we can control and that we rely on. And that's how we're using it. And that's really important. I think the more as we go on this journey, I think, as you said, as you alluded to, the example of a digital rehearsal, there will be so many of these examples and either posted online or posted where it's going to mine that data and yes, pick up things that we forget. And I think that's something that we all have to be open to and to see how we can use it in the best possible way.
And I'd like to chat about career and leadership for people listening to the podcast today, because I think your story is fantastic. You go, I'll do engineering. That sounds interesting. You worked all over the world. You worked some great companies, brilliant projects. Now you've started your own firm and you're running the show. That's a long way up. For other people who have ambition in engineering, what do you think are the kind of the skills that mattered most for you going from site planner to running the show in the boardroom?
Funnily enough, I was back in UCD over the last 2 weeks giving a lecture in planning, which was back to where I started in a certain way and trying to, I suppose, impare some knowledge on the students there. The big thing that stuck with me and that I was saying with them is communication and talking to people. And I think from a leadership perspective or as a young graduate starting off their career, I think it's so important in today's world to talk and to communicate with your peers. I know it's much more challenging now. We have different methods of working. We have hybrid working. We have working from home. We have the use of Teams and email and everything. But sometimes it can be quite frustrating to work in that. Like, I think the office environment that I come into today or every day is so much different to when I started over 20 years ago. People are sitting at their desks with headphones on. It's just different. I could have never imagined doing that. And that's not just Strata, that's many different organizations. And while people are focused on getting their work done, I think that part to communicate is lost a little bit. And I think as an engineer or construction professional, obviously you have to have the technical knowledge and the grounding. That goes without saying. But as I always say to people, it's that time to talk, time to ask questions, that time to listen. In particular as well, growing up and I suppose walking around construction sites, there's so much to be learned by just stopping and watching and looking at what's going on around you. And then even the people on the ground that are executing the works, as an engineer, it's so important to talk to them. It's so important to ask them questions because they're the people that are doing the physical work. And I know there's a lot of offsite production and things are changing in that way as well. But still, the people installing things, they're a fountain of knowledge and expertise on how things go together. And I think, to be inquisitive, to put your hand up for things, to think outside the box as well. An engineering profession opens up the door to many different facets of construction. And as a young engineer, whether it be in planning or site engineering, be open to do different things that are maybe outside your wheelhouse a little bit to challenge yourself. And I think that, I suppose, that approach can be, very good for your career in the long term. I would also say, well, look, we live in a much faster paced world at the moment and people like to move fast, and particularly younger people coming into the industry, they're a little bit impatient. You can see sometimes in terms of career progression. And I would just say that, it's also important to get those early years, to put your head down, to get that experience. And then once you have that under your belt, then you can start, I suppose, moving into different environments. Whereas you start as an engineer and you want to be a project manager after 2 years, you have a little bit of a road to learn. And sometimes to go slow, to go fast is good. That's probably from the perspective of just career progression and just looking at it from that way. In terms of, I suppose, some days I look around and I go, jeepers, how did we get here? We have an office. We have 60 people now. We have an office in Ireland, in Dublin, our head office in London, in Stockholm, and in Brazil. And look, sometimes you just don't think, things just happen, but it's taking opportunities. I suppose my mindset has always been not to say no to things first anyway. My wife might differ to that at home, but it's just to be open to opportunities and to respect people as well. I think that's really important. It might be a cliche, but we do try to have a really good culture here in our organization, and we have different nationalities from all over the world working with us in Strata. And look, it's about, as a leader, I think, people have a life in work and outside of work, and it's about being empathetic to that and actually taking an interest in that. And I think that goes a long way to, it's interesting. I like people. I like meeting new people. I'm interested in what they're doing. And, I suppose I like to see people doing well as well. And that drives me on a lot.
I love everything that you're saying. And I would never have thought of communications as being kind of like a foundational skill. And, I bet in universities, it's not something that they teach as part of the course for engineering. I know that Engineers Ireland they have a communication and presentation skill thing, but that's more for, to be able to communicate effectively during a project meeting or to give presentations and stuff like that. But it's back again to what you're saying. It's one little thing at a time and using that communication to get people on board and to lead people. And that's how you can make amazing things happen. Again, thinking about other people who are listening to the podcast and they want to advance their career and we want to learn from you. That's one foundational skill, which I think is really interesting. If you wanted to make an investment in your career, what would you advise people to do?
I think practical experience is really important, actually. I think, particularly even if you're going through college or university, during the summers, to try and get that practical experience and get that knowledge, because I do think it is a shortcoming in our education process at the moment. I think in too many ways it's gone too theoretical and that connection to industry is lost. And probably it's very easy for me to say that now after 20 years and running my own business. But when you go back, there is a disconnect with what happens in the real world and how we're taught in university. And I think...
Bigger than a disconnect, I would have said.
Look, you have to bridge that gap as a young engineer. So you have to try and get that practical experience yourself. And that's on you, I think, as well, to do that. And even, there's a massive skills shortage on sites at the moment. The whole thing, when I was growing up, it was, go be a labourer on a construction site during the summer months. That doesn't happen, I guess, so much anymore. But look, it's really important. That's where you learn a huge amount and you learn how to navigate those situations. I think, as I said, we take on interns and we have a graduate program. And I think really it's about being flexible as well in your early career. Everyone has to go through, it doesn't matter, even starting out, you have to go through maybe the mundane tasks to get the stripes to move on to the next thing. And it's not to look at them as a torturous exercise. It's to look at them as building blocks, and they're there for a reason, to try and get people to understand it's all about, as you say, the small pieces, how they all come together. And it comes back to having that patience to do that. And I think the flexibility, I think as well, international travel, getting the opportunity to travel and to work internationally on different projects is a huge thing as a young engineer, and to be open to that, because the experiences that you get both culturally, I think, number one, and from an engineering perspective are very different. It's just building that knowledge bank, building that repertoire, and don't be relying on emails all the time as well, I would say, is a big thing. Pick up the phone. That's another big thing. younger people find it more difficult to communicate. And that's with AI and with everything, that's going to become more and more of a challenge. But I think if you can break that cycle, I think that's really important. If you can have that confidence to speak and to ask and to talk, I think it's really good and really powerful.
I think if people are listening to this and they take away just one thing, I think that communication thing is fantastic. I mean, you've given us so much solid advice in just a half an hour, so I'm delighted with it. That one has really stuck with me, but I suppose as a communicator, it probably would, because that's my business. If you are interested in learning more about Enda's insights into strategic construction planning and innovation and managing complex projects, you can find a link to Strata's website in the show notes. I'll also throw in a link to Enda directly on LinkedIn, and I'll dig out a link for that communication course that Engineers Ireland do as well, so you can look that up if you want. All in the description for you now. But for now, Enda Grimes, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast.
Thanks, Dusty.
We hope you enjoyed our conversation today. If you do know another engineer who would appreciate insights like this, please share our podcast with them. They can find us simply by searching for Engineers Ireland wherever they listen to podcasts. This episode is produced by justpod.io for Engineers Ireland. For advanced episodes, more information on the latest trends in infrastructure or career development advice, you can find a library of information on our website at engineersireland.ie. Until next time, from myself, Dusty Rhodes, thank you for listening.